It's good to have this number present for our service this evening. It's a cool evening outside, and if you shook hands with me tonight, you probably found my hands to be cold. I really had no idea what kind of clothes to bring this week. When I left Tennessee, it was quite warm and sunshiny last Saturday, and it's always a guessing game this time of year to know whether to wear winter clothes or not. But it's warm in here, it's comfortable where we are, and so we're glad to be together tonight to study for a little while about God's Word. We're going to talk tonight about being a peacemaker as one of the ways that we can let our light shine. This is another of these little practical things by which we can sometimes do far more good than we might think. Just in these ordinary ways of being really what God requires us as His people to be, we find that when we do these things, that it not only benefits us, but it is influential, it touches other people's lives. In James chapter 3, where James is talking about the wisdom that is from above, he said, "It is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." He says, "The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." It's interesting in the scope of just these two verses where he's talking about heavenly wisdom as different from the wisdom that comes from below that he had talked about in verse 15, that which is earthly and sensual and demonic. The wisdom that would come from God has a lot to do with peace, doesn't it? And that's what we want to try to emphasize tonight. Same thing is true about this subject that we've said about several of our other topics, and that is what we see going on in the world around us emphasizes a special need, I think, in the days in which we live for us to, in this case, practice being a peacemaker. If there's anything that characterizes the world in which we live, it is discord. If you tried to list all of the different kinds of strife that there are in the world, it would be a long list, wouldn't it? And so we have a lot of synonyms for discord and strife and disruption. It is the world in which we live is not just filled with discord. So often it's serious enough that you'd have to call it strife and even violence. And all of that, of course, makes it such that when we experience some peace in this world, it's a very beautiful thing. Our hearts are drawn to images of peace and harmony, and very few, I think, ideas or words in our language that have any more pleasant associations than the word peace. You may be aware that in the Hebrew language, from which our Old Testament books was translated, that the Hebrew word for peace was shalom. And even today, Jewish people greet one another with that greeting, shalom. And in general, it means peace. But the interesting thing about the word shalom is that it was a more general word. It had to do with more than just the absence of strife. That's the most basic kind of peace, is when people are not at war with one another. But when the Hebrews used that word shalom, they didn't just mean that you weren't fighting with somebody, that you had that kind of peace, but that you had all of the good things in life. Shalom had to do with positive well-being as well as the absence of discord. And when even today a Jewish person speaks that as a blessing or a greeting, what they're wishing is that a person might have all the best that this life has to offer. Peace in all of its different dimensions. And it's a high blessing when that word is used. And that, of course, is the word used back in Numbers chapter 6 in that priestly blessing, that the priests were commanded to speak over the nation of Israel. And we have a song based upon this blessing. Numbers chapter 6, verse 24. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. There's our word. May the Lord give you peace. And so those are beautiful words, and they convey a very beautiful sentiment, don't they? Where one person is wishing peace and all of its best meanings upon certain people. In the New Testament, of course, Jesus, one of the prophecies in the Old Testament that predicted him, described him as one who would be a Prince of Peace. Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. And so when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, in those verses that we call the Beatitudes, one of the Beatitudes pronounced a blessing on the peacemakers. We are to be like him, and that we are to be those who foster peace and promote that. We are to be agents of God's peace in our world. When there is the absence of peace, and there is strife or maybe even violence, discord and enmity and all of those things, all of those are always the result in some way or another from self-will. And when a person puts his own will at the top of the list, and he is going to pursue his will no matter what inevitably is going to happen? Sooner or later, he's going to meet another person who has the same philosophy of saying, it's my will at all costs. And when those two people butt heads, there's going to be strife. If neither is willing to yield, if both are intent on what they want at any cost, then that's where strife comes from, isn't it? From the disposition that says, my will be done. I will pursue my will at all costs. I happened to be on a young friend's Facebook page not too long ago. He's a college-age student and sort of an eccentric young man in some ways. And on his Facebook page where they give you the chance to kind of give a slogan or just a saying that personifies who you are, you know what he thought described him? It said, it's my will against yours now, and I am going to win. Well, that doesn't speak of a very gentle disposition, doesn't it? And that sounds extreme, but that's really what it comes down to, isn't it, when we have strife? We are saying, it's my will against yours, and I'm going to conquer your will. My will be the stronger. That's how it got started in the Garden of Eden, isn't it? What was one of the first things that began to happen after Adam and Eve had committed the sin of eating the forbidden fruit? Well, they started bickering and quarreling among themselves, each blaming it on the other, and Eve blaming it on the devil. You know, there never had been any arguments or any blaming or any of that in the garden until sin got them focused on their will rather than God's will. And what happened very quickly after that? As they were cast out of the garden and the world began to be populated, discord became so much the norm, and it got so much worse that by the time we get to the day of Noah, there just was hardly anything but violence in the world. People have forgotten anything about yielding to God or to anybody else. It was the law of the jungle. You know, might makes right. And the only way I won't get my will is if you're stronger than I am and you keep me from it. But if I can impose my will on you, then that's what I'm going to do. If I have to kill you to get my way. So self-will is where strife comes from. Back here in James chapter 4, James indicates in the first few verses of James 4 that there really never is an instance of strife without the sinful self-will of somebody insisting on having what he wants at somebody else's expense. Verse 1, where do wars and fightings come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. So you murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. It's an accurate description of many people, isn't it? Who want what they want And the only thing that will stop them from that is meeting somebody who has more power than they do, who can physically keep them from exercising that will. That's where strife comes from. If there weren't any self-will in the world, there wouldn't be any discord. If everybody was still yielding to God's will and then yielding in love to one another, there would be no strife. So it's not a surprise, is it, when we turn over to Galatians chapter 5 and we hear Paul describing the works of the flesh, that several of those have to do with strife or discord in some kind of a way. Turn over there with me to Galatians 5, beginning in verse 19. I counted up one time how many of these had to do with strife. I've forgotten what the number was now. But listen, the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery. Now here come the ones that have to do with strife. Hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelry, and the like. I don't know how many is on that list, but at least half of them, by my estimate, have to do with some kind of strife. That's one of the principal ways that sin shows up in the world. And we just need to understand where strife comes from. I guess I should look at my own notes, shouldn't it? It says no fewer than 9 out of 17 are sins of discord. It helps to read your own notes once in a while. I don't always do that. I started to raise my hand when Jason asked if anybody needed a copy of this outline tonight. Probably should have taken one of those. So that puts this in a very serious light, doesn't it? If you've got a problem with strife, even in its more mild forms, even in the more respectable forms, then you've got a problem with self-will, and that's a sinful problem. That puts this in a much more serious light than a lot of people would like to think. And I see it almost everywhere I turn. I see it when I look in the mirror, for one thing. Too many times I impose my will on someone else at the cost of the peace between us. But I see some people not only who tend in the direction of self-will and strife, but they apparently are proud of that. Sunday morning at the hotel, when I was eating breakfast downstairs, there was a family sitting next to me, and they were talking about some kind of altercation that the husband in this family had had with whoever was working at the desk that morning. There was something, I didn't hear all of the conversation, but there was something he was very upset about. He didn't think something was going right there at the hotel, something hadn't been done right, and he had, I guess he had just really raked the desk clerk over the coals about it, as if she could do anything about it. He demanded to see the manager, and she said there's not a manager on duty on Sunday morning. So he hadn't gotten satisfaction. He had come back to the table there in the breakfast buffet bar, and he was talking to his family about what a lousy hotel this is, how you can't get anybody to do anything right anymore, and what a sorry shame it was that they didn't have a manager on duty. And I could just tell from the tone of his voice that he's one of these swaggering, bully types that just loves confrontation. Just loves opportunities where he can show what a big man that he thinks he is. And sure enough, that wasn't enough for him. When they finished their meal, he went back out to the desk clerk, and as I left to go back upstairs to my room, he was chewing her out again. And she was taking it as she's been trained to do in those kinds of situations. If you've ever worked with the public, you know how often this happens. But I shook my head and said, his wife has got to be embarrassed that her husband is proud of himself for that kind of behavior. Antagonistic, full of self-will. It's my will, and if you don't do what I want, then you're going to pay a price. Not just doing it, but apparently thinking that's very macho and very mature on his part. He's not going to let anybody run over him. Well, that's sinful. That's not just a slight foible not just something that's less than ideal in his character. That's a sinful character trait that will send him, if he doesn't repent of it, straight to hell. And that's just how serious the matter of strife is, because it comes from an attitude that says, my will, and if there's anything at the heart of sin, it's that attitude of saying, my will be done. The ultimate answer, of course, if that's the problem, the ultimate answer to that is the gospel. The forgiveness, first of all, that will be available in the gospel for times in the past when we've sinfully and selfishly, ridden roughshod over somebody. But then the help that comes in the gospel as we live our lives in Christ to overcome that problem and to outgrow that sinful attitude of saying, my will be done. And so if 9 out of 17 of those works of the flesh have to do with strife, we're not surprised when we turn to the fruit of the Spirit to see how peaceful those qualities are. Verse 22 of Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, there's our word again, long-suffering, which has a whole lot to do with peace, doesn't it? Kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. You see how very different those are from the works of the flesh, simply in terms of comparison of traits that produce strife as opposed to those that will minimize strife in every possible way. It's the gospel that's the answer to strife. And apart from God, if you leave God out of the picture, the search for peace ultimately is going to come up short. Yes, there are certain kinds of peace that could be promoted by just worldly peacemakers. But ultimately, if the problem is sinful self-will, then the solution of that's going to have to be something that involves the forgiveness of that sin and then the help of God to get a person over that selfish attitude that's producing that strife. Isaiah 48 verse 22, the famous statement, there is no peace for the wicked. Any peace that a wicked person has, wicked because of self-will, any peace that he has is almost going to be accidental. It'll be something that he enjoys despite the fact that he's pulling in the opposite direction. So reconciliation to God is got to be the starting point for any kind of peace, and that can only come through the gospel of Christ. Peace begins when men submit to the reign of Christ in their hearts, and they learn how to begin saying, thy will be done. There's a higher will here that's got to be considered than what I want. Luke chapter 2 and verse 14 describes the gospel as the good news of what? Peace. Peace and goodwill is how it's described. So the highest peace made possible, kind of peace that's produced by the gospel, is the peace that makes all the other kinds of peace in the world a practical reality. If you don't start by dealing with the enmity that exists between us and our God, then you're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, trying to treat these other kinds of strife and find some way to calm the waters when you're really not dealing with the root of the problem. Romans chapter 5 and verse 1 talks about the peace, the primary peace that comes from the gospel. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. A lot of people who are not peaceful, they're more warlike, like that fellow that I just described to you. Where that's coming from a lot of times is that they're at war within themselves. They don't like themselves. They got inner conflict, and where that's coming from is that they know they're at odds with God. Your relationship with God is broken. That makes it impossible for you to respect yourself, and so you're at odds even in your own mind, and that spills out in these ugly confrontations with other people. And so it ultimately all goes back to enmity, the state of being enemies with God. And the gospel is the only thing that can rectify that. Yes, there are support groups you can go to if you've got anger management issues. There are books at Barnes & Noble that you can buy that would, help in a temporary kind of way. But ultimately, all strife comes from sin, from sinful self-will, and it's only the gospel that can fix that problem in any kind of significant way. But when the gospel establishes peace between a person and God, then that makes possible a different kind of peace of that person within himself, and then peace of that person with others. So we'll have to start looking for the answer of peace with the gospel. Well, most of us in the room tonight are people who have obeyed the gospel. We wear the name of Christ. We desire to worship with congregations that faithfully follow the will of Christ. That's what we want to be, simply the followers of the Lord. So obviously, if we're going to follow this Lord, then there's going to have to, the subject of peace is going to have to be dealt with. We can't be peacemakers. There won't be any light that'll shine from our lives in that kind of way unless our own relationships with people are peaceful. Unless the gospel has made a difference in the way we deal with our family and our next door neighbors and people we work with, then who are we kidding when we preach and teach, blessed are the peacemakers? And shame on you out there in the world for such strife and such discord if our own relationships don't show that the gospel has made a different person out of us. That we have more peaceful relationships with the people that we're connected to than we would have if we weren't Christians. And this is an area where, in the words of the old tire commercial, where the rubber meets the road. This is one of the primary areas where people have a right to look to see if our faith is real. We profess Christ. We try to teach the gospel. But is it real in our own lives? Well, we would say yes. But one of the ultimate proofs of whether the gospel is real in our own life is to look at our own relationships. Whether they are broken and warlike, or whether we are doing everything we can on our side of those relationships to make peace and real peace. Now, it obviously needs to be said that the Lord never advocated peace at any price. Even in the Lord's life, there was conflict, wasn't there? Conflict that ultimately cost him his life. He could have smoothed over the tempest that ultimately cost him his life by denying the truth about who he was. But by acknowledging the truth, then some strife took place that ended up having him put to death. Truth is more important than peace. We certainly see that in the Lord's life. And the statement was made in Jeremiah, that it's wrong to say peace, peace, when there is no peace. It's wrong just to sweep problems under the rug. But that said, I want you to be careful when you find yourself in some conflicted situation and there's strife between you and somebody else. I want you to be careful always not to just assume that it's the other person's fault. I'm a righteous person, and like the Lord, I teach the truth, and so that's going to create strife. And so if there's strife, it's always the other person's problem for not meekly receiving the truth that I've tried to teach to them. Listen to me. Whenever we are involved in strife, it had better not be as a result of any purely selfish promotion of our own agenda or our own mere propensity for combat. I think some people just like combat. They should enjoy it. Conflict, controversy, they thrive on it. And many times don't see that about themselves. They would deny that, but the evidence is clear. Every one of their relationships and the way they go about doing almost anything they do, it produces strife, and then they'll get up and preach sermons, if they're preachers, on the beauty of peace and say, well, I've done everything I can do to promote peace, but I've got to teach the truth, and so that just creates some warfare. Well, it does, But it takes a person of more honesty than most of us have to see when we are at least a part of the problem. I have very rarely in my young life seen any serious conflicts where there wasn't a lot of blame to be assigned to everybody involved. There's a lot of wisdom to that proverb that says, where no fuel is added to the fire goes out. It takes two, not only to tango, but to tangle, as somebody says. And if there's conflict, there's a high probability that I'm adding to that unnecessarily. It's not merely a matter of me doing what the Lord did, teaching the truth. And the Lord never even exercised poor judgment in the way He did what was right. He not only said what was right, He said it in exactly the right way every time. Any conflict that arose was never His fault. You and I will hardly ever be able to say that. There'll almost always be some blame on our part for having engaged in strife that stemmed from self-will in our own hearts. So Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. We find ourselves in conflict and our own relationships are not what they ought to be. Number one, we need to understand that we're not going to be in a worshiping relationship with the Lord until we've done everything we can do to bring peace. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you come with your gift before the altar, and you know your brother has something against you. There's a broken relationship that you haven't done everything you could do to mend that relationship. The Lord is not interested in your worship until you straighten that out. So it's helpful for us to ask anytime we find ourselves in a strife-torn situation, have I done anything sinfully to help bring this about or to keep it going? And if I have I truly repented of that? And can I honestly say that I have done everything within the limits of what is right and honorable to mend this relationship? Have I left no stone unturned, trying to do whatever I could to bring back peace into this relationship? Sometimes, no matter what we do, there will be strife. The other person will simply insist on there continuing to be strife. But listen to me. We had better be able to honestly say that if that's the case, we have done everything that was in our power to reconcile that broken relationship. We are commanded in Hebrews 12 and verse 14 to pursue peace. We are to aspire to a quiet and peaceable life, as Paul taught us in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 2, to pray for the higher authorities that they'll just leave us alone and let us lead a quiet and peaceable life. That's what we need to aspire to. I think some people would be a step in the right direction if they even saw that as desirable. Some people wouldn't even think a peaceful life would be desirable. But the stronger statement is the one there in Hebrews where he says, pursue peace. One time I heard my friend Bob Buchanan preaching on the Beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, pointed out that there's a difference between being a peace lover and a peacemaker. Oh, a lot of people pay lip service to the nobility of peace, but they won't lift a finger to do anything about it. They'll wish for it, naively wish that people would just get along better than they do, but they're not going to roll up their sleeves and do any serious work to help to bring that about. And I'll tell you, it takes work. It takes serious work when there's strife for somebody to get involved and in a mature, godly way take some actual steps to try to reconcile those broken relationships. What about our homes? If there's any place that ought to be a haven of peace, it ought to be our home. We live in a violent, discordant world. Surely when we come home, that can be a place of rest and peace. Unfortunately, for many of us, our homes are just another place where there's discord. And shame on us if we proclaim ourselves to be the Lord's people. We're not doing what we can do in our homes, not just to love peace, but to pursue peace, to be a peacemaker. What about the congregational relationship? I've heard very few people in my lifetime own up to having caused strife, ungodly, sinful strife in the congregation. But somebody causes it. It doesn't just drop down out of the sky. But you very rarely hear anybody own up to their part of the responsibility for having torn up the congregation and produced discord where there shouldn't have been any. Are we peacemakers? When war breaks out, which side can count on us? The side that wants to make war? Or are we going to be a part of the solution? One of those who can be counted on to bring some wisdom to the situation, some maturity, some spiritual mindedness, and make a godly effort to root out the problem of sinful self-will, whether in our own hearts or that of somebody else, and once again, to get us back to the work of the Lord. Did you remember when we mentioned James chapter 4 a minute ago? Or the last couple of verses of chapter 3, where he says in verse 18, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. That's true, isn't it? Whatever the fruit of righteousness is, however you want to think about that, he's talking about righteousness in terms of a crop that could be sown out in a field. You can't sow a crop in any kind of field. It's all torn up, where some kind of battle is taking place on that field. Farmers have to have a peaceful situation in their fields before they can sow a crop. And the crop that's got to, the seed that's got to be sown that's going to produce righteousness can't be planted in an atmosphere of conflict and warfare. And that's one reason so many congregations are not doing the Lord's work. They're not engaging in evangelism. They're not reaching out to try to reach the lost with the gospel because they're fighting among themselves. And the Lord's work won't be done until they quit fighting. Until peace is reestablished, nothing good will happen. And so it's a serious thing when there's congregational strife. What about our communities and our neighborhoods? Are we the agents of God's peace in those situations? Among the non-Christians who know you, whether in your neighborhood or maybe in a school environment or in the business world or in government or wherever, are you known as a dependable peacemaker? I tell you, if anybody in the community has ever appealed to you to be a mediator and to help bring some people back together, you've been paid a high compliment as a child of God. Who ought there to be in a community that people would not know as a peacemaker and would turn to as a person who can help us bring this thing back together? Unfortunately, we're not known for that. We're known for strife and warfare is what we're known for. I had an interesting conversation a couple of weeks ago. I was in Florida. Herb and Trish Heinley and I were sitting around talking at lunch one day, and it came up about the odd names that there sometimes are for groups of animals. Some of those are very humorous. You know what a group of crows is? It's a murder of crows. It's interesting how that came to be. You know what a group of peacocks is? It's an ostentation of peacocks. It's apt, isn't it? I said, what would you call a group of Christians? I said, maybe an argument of Christians would be the applicable term. Argumentation is as descriptive of us as ostentation is of peacocks, unfortunately. In our communities, we're known for such warfare that unbelievers who know us, we would be the last person they would turn to help mediate some dispute in the community or at a school or at a workplace. But we ought to be known as people who are skilled in the godly wisdom, not just of wishing for peace, but having some know-how when it comes to making peace, re-achieving a peaceful situation that doesn't sacrifice truth, but that deals with the issue of sinful self-will in the hearts of everybody in the conflict. if there's ever going to be peace in a conflictual situation, somebody is going to have to yield. And that's hard to do it. Not many of us are very good at yielding. We somehow always seem to think that if there's anybody who needs to yield so that we can have peace, it's the other person. If they would just yield, we could have peace. I almost chuckle anymore when I pull on the on-ramp of a freeway, and it says yield. I don't know how some people ever get on the highway because they don't know how to do that. All they know is forge right ahead and everybody better get out of my way. Yielding is hard. And I don't know of anything that tests the wisdom of people any more than trying to figure out when to yield and when not to yield. That's a hard discernment to make in the real world. If you're good at that, I want you to explain to me how to do a better job of that, because that's what has to happen. It enables us to live peaceably. Back here in James again, do you remember that he said the wisdom that is from above is first pure? It's interesting that he puts purity in front of peaceableness. See, there's got to be truth and purity, then peaceableness. But listen to these others. Gentle, willing to yield, that is, easy to be persuaded. You're able to be reasoned with and willing to yield. Full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Those are tough qualities. Not many of us have any of those in any measurable amount, and that's one reason we have so little peace in our lives. There's a time not to yield. There is a time to yield, and it takes a wise man to know which is which. But if you never yield, if you always think it's the other person's responsibility, they're in the wrong and they'll have to yield, and as soon as they come begging my forgiveness, then we can have peace again, then you're not going to have any peace. Peace requires sometimes knowing that I need to simply turn the other cheek. I need to simply let myself be taken advantage of, if that's what it takes, rather than engage in a warfare that would drag the Lord's name through the mud, even in the eyes of the community. There's a time to let yourself be taken advantage of. Paul even recommends in 1 Corinthians 6 that there's a time to let yourself be financially defrauded by a brother rather than go to war over it. What we think we have to have and what our interests are not nearly as high in the scheme of what's really important as we sometimes think. Very often it'll be needful for me simply to say, well, whatever I may have wanted here, I decide I'm going to yield to the other person. And when somebody yields, it's not going to be long before the fire goes out, because that takes fuel out of it. One person can't fight by himself. He's got to have an antagonist who's meeting him in kind. And so when somebody yields, pretty soon the fire is going to go out. So we need to have relationships in our own lives that are peaceful. What I want you to recognize here finally is that we need also to be agents of peace among other people to the extent that we have the opportunity. And when it comes to conflict among other people around us, we ought to be peacemakers rather than troublemakers. I've known a few people in my life who were such chronic troublemakers that you could look at every congregation they've ever been a member of, every friendship they've ever had, every neighborhood they've ever lived in, and all you see is a history of having made trouble. And they can't see that they're the common denominator in every one of those scenarios. They think they've just had the unusual bad luck to run into a lot of people who can't get along with them. Nice people though they are. They can't see that they're the ones who are stirring up the trouble. They're causing the problem. We need not be that way. We need to be the other way. Those who have a track record, a demonstrable track record of having made peace. We need to be bridge builders rather than bridge destroyers. And it requires work. There's a difference between being a peacemaker and simply one who wishes for peace. So when there's strife, do you let other people do the work of reconciliation and bringing peace? Or are you willing to get involved, roll up your sleeves, and go to work? Not only does it require work, it comes at a price. You don't always need to involve yourself in every instance of strife that comes to your attention. Proverbs talks about the folly of picking up a dog by its ears. There's sometimes just keep your nose out of somebody else's business. But there will be occasions when there's strife, and maybe because of a uniquely close relationship you have to the parties who are at strife, you'll be in the front line of duty of those who have some responsibility to get involved and try to help make peace. And the tempting thing is to say, no, I don't want to get involved in that. And to excuse not doing anything just because we know there's liable to be a price to be paid for getting involved in that. We're going to come out of that with somebody not liking us nearly as much as they did if we do what the Lord would want to be done in that situation. But somebody's got to take the risk and make the sacrifices if there's going to be peace. We can't just let other people pay that price. How much influence do you have in the world? Before you say you don't have any, be careful. All of us have some influence. In fact, more people are watching our example than we know. And to what extent are we using the influence that we have to make peace? If the gospel is where peace ultimately comes from, then there's no peacemaking effort any higher on the scale than personal evangelism. If you're known as a personal evangelist, then you're being a peacemaker in the very highest sense of that term. So are we communicators of the gospel of peace? When there's strife, can we do more than just say, oh, let's just hug one another and be friends again? Are we those who are willing to bring truth to bear? Sometimes truth that some of the parties don't want to hear in order for the root of the problem to be dealt with. I mentioned in the other lesson about the fact that we live in a world where there are a lot of people who don't know that anybody cares for them. We need to be those through whom they hear the good news, that at least God does care for them. Likewise, our neighbors are at war with one another. Are we those through whom they come to hear, maybe for the first time in their lives, that there is a message that can provide a peace that's radically different than any other kind of peace that's ever been known in the world? And if they're at war with their God, are we going to be those through whom they hear that God has made it possible for us to come back home and be friends with Him again? That's the gospel. And we're surrounded by people who don't know about this message. They haven't yet heard that it's possible to come back home. And we need to be those from whom they hear that good message. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3 talks about making peace as a part of the good life. Remember what he said, 1 Peter 3 verse 10? He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. Become a peacemaker. Life will be good for you in a sense that it couldn't be good otherwise. That's a part of the truly good life, being a peacemaker. So as far as it depends upon us, let us do what Paul said in Romans 12. Let us live peaceably with all people. Let us be those who put the fire out rather than those who throw extra fuel on the fire and stoke it into a higher blaze. It takes hard work, but we need to be diligent about the beatitude of those who are blessed because they are peacemakers. To do the work that's involved in that, and when we do, I'll tell you, some light is going to shine from our lives. There'll be people who see that we have a message and we are living a life consistent with that message, and in our own relationships we are demonstrating that this is the message of peace, and they'll soon be asking some questions about that, because that'll be different from what they're seeing elsewhere in the world. So let's be a peacemaker and let that kind of light shine from our lives. We'll finish tomorrow night with a lesson on overcoming temptation. I don't know if you've ever thought about overcoming temptation as a way that you can have a good influence on somebody else. You normally think of overcoming temptation as something that we need to do because we need to keep away from the sin ourselves. But I want to tell you tomorrow night, and I put this lesson last deliberately, this is one of the most powerful ways that you can set a good example for everybody who's connected to you, to simply say no to sin. I hope that you can be with us tomorrow night for the final lesson in these studies. Well, that'll be enough for tonight. We're glad that you're here and glad that we've had this time together. Maybe that you need to take some public step in order to leave this assembly in a right relationship with God. What that would be would depend on where you are in relationship to God. If you study the New Testament and you know what for you needs to be the next step, and you need to be encouraged by that, it may be something that you require the help of somebody else. If you've never obeyed the gospel, never been baptized into Christ, that kind of requires some assistance, and we'd be happy to provide that assistance. Maybe you need to be stirred up. If that's what you need, we'd be glad to serve that purpose in your life as well. But don't leave this assembly without having taken the step that you know you need to take. If we can help you take it, won't you come and let us know of that right now while we stand and sing.